So I'm going to do something a little bit different for this video. I'm going to do one of my favorite things to do in sim racing, and that is just simply to hop in a car that I'll probably never own and just drive it. We're going to be driving on the Tokyo Expressway thanks to the SRP Revival mod, and this is one of my favorite things to do in all of sim racing. This is actually the main reason I built my rig, is just to drive road cars around, not race all the time. And does that make it like not sim racing? I don't know. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what I do want to talk about is something that I have been thinking about lately based on sentiments that I've seen online, Reddit, sim racing groups on Facebook. I'm in a bunch of sim racing groups on Facebook, and one day somebody asked a very simple question. Why is GT Sport not a sim? And of course, that brought all of the elitists out of the woodwork to talk about how Gran Turismo and Forza and games of that ilk were not sim, and you should only be playing R-Factor, Settle Corsa, and whatnot. And there were some valid points made on both sides of that, but I thought, yeah, why isn't GT Sport a sim? And this is from someone who does not really play GT Sport, and I don't really consider it to be, not on the same level as iRacing or Assetto Corsa or R-Factor 2, but isn't it a sim? Just because the experience is not as simulative as the other games that I mentioned, that doesn't mean that it's not a sim. So I want to talk about that a little bit and really talk about this elitist attitude that I've seen in sim racing, especially over the past year, with sim racing becoming as popular as it's gotten to be worldwide, about what's a sim and what's not, and what you should be playing and why you should play whatever. Okay, so there's something that I always say to everyone, that sim racing is a spectrum. Okay, it's not this monolithic thing. You can't group all of the sim racing games into this cluster and say this is a sim, this is not a sim. There are criteria that might make a game more realistic or simulative than another game. If you look at a spectrum, on your far, let's say on your far left, that's your hardcore sims. That's going to be your R-Factor 2, your Assetto Corsa, your ACC, your iRacing, whatever. And then on the far right, you're going to have games, not necessarily simulations, but you're going to have your Need for Speed games and like your Initial D arcade games. And then somewhere in the middle is where you're going to get your like Project Cars 2, Gran Turismo, Forza, and maybe closer on the arcade side, Forza Horizon. And to me, that is a great way to look at sim racing titles. Where do they fall on that particular spectrum? And a game like GT Sport actually falls a little bit more to the left than it does even the middle, I think. One of the things you have to look at is, well, how is this game marketed? Is the intent of the game to be a simulation type experience? And I think for Gran Turismo and Forza, not Forza Horizon, but the regular Forza titles, I think that is the intent of those games, is to be a simulation type experience, but a little more accessible for the average gamer, considering the primary platform for those titles is gaming consoles. I know that the Forza games are actually also on PC, but the primary demographic for those games are Xbox and PlayStation gamers. So they have to make those games a little bit more accessible rather than falling into the sim racing niche genre that we're all big fans of. The reason being is, like, those guys got to make money too. And nobody really wants to hear this, but sim racing titles just don't make a lot of money. They just don't. In fact, I'd be willing to bet, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'd be willing to bet that GT Sport has sold more copies than the top 3 or 4 pure hardcore sim racing titles combined. That's just the way it is. So developers are always stuck in a rock and a hard place. Hey, what do we want this game to be? And I think that's probably what happened with Project Cars 3. I think they took a look at the numbers that Forza and Gran Turismo were doing and say, hey, we can do that too. We have a pretty good base, and they did with Project Cars 2, but they veered a little too far to the right side of the spectrum, and I think that turned a lot of the main fan base off. So me personally, what do I consider a sim? Well, there's a few different criteria that I like to use in order to determine how simulative an experience is going to be. First is physics. I think that that's probably the most important aspect of sim racing for sim racers. How realistic are the physics? How does the car handle? If it's a big heavy car, does it feel like a big heavy car? If it's a light nimble quick car, does it feel like a light nimble quick car? When you crash into a wall, what happens? Does your car fly up in the air? Or does it, spin around? Or all of these things help the sim experience. A game like, for instance, Need for Speed, and I love the Need for Speed games, but the Need for Speed games just don't have realistic physics. The cars don't handle realistically. They don't crash realistically. So, of course, I don't think you can say that that is a realistic simulative experience. Second, tire model. I know tire model kind of goes hand in hand with the physics, but tire model is actually, I think, deserves its own separate criteria. Tire model is simply how do the tires in the game react to being driven on? Do they heat up? Do the brakes heat up the inside of the tires? Do the sidewall flex? Do the tires wear properly? And this is a tough one for a lot of different games, because there are a lot of games that do model the tires properly, but it's a question of how realistically does it do it. Another thing that's important to note, especially with all of these criteria, particularly physics and tire model, a lot of these are super subjective. The truth is 99.99% of us have never driven or won't drive a car to its absolute limits enough to be able to say, yep, that's realistic. That's the absolute truth of the matter. We are just giving an approximation based on our own driving experiences. Now, there are guys out there who are real race drivers who often have a lot of things to say about sim racing. There are a lot of guys out there who engage in both. We all know about James Baldwin. He was a sim racer who is now a famous GT racer. David Perel is a GT3 racer, which has a YouTube channel in which he regularly races a Assetto Corsa Competizione. So there are guys out there that can say, hey, no, this is realistic or this is not realistic, but most of us cannot do that. So I want everyone to keep that in mind when you're gauging whether or not X title is a sim or not. Thirdly, I'm going to use immersive features as a criteria. And this is kind of, this is admittedly a weird one because this includes graphics and sound mostly, but it has to feel and look realistic, in my opinion, to be more of a sim. And this is, to a lot of sim racers, this one isn't all that important. Take, for instance, R-Factor 2. R-Factor 2 is not the prettiest game, although with recent content upgrades, I mean, it gets the job done. Same with iRacing. iRacing is based on a old engine, and sometimes, especially with the legacy models, it looks it. Even Assetto Corsa is almost 8 years old at this point, and it's taken third-party mods to make it look really gorgeous with Soul and content shaders patch. But there's a reason why those mods come out and we all flock to them, because they make the game look and feel more realistic. When you've got an awesome setup where you've got triple monitors or VR and you can look around the cockpit of your car and it looks like the car that you are actually supposed to be driving, that is a very engaging experience when it comes to sim racing and in gaming. And the thing is, you don't get that with a lot of titles that fall on the far right of the spectrum. For instance, they took cockpit view out of the Need for Speed games. It's one of the reasons why I don't play them anymore, because it's just not quite as immersive. Those little graphical and audio features, in my opinion, enhance the realism of a game and thus make it a more simulative experience. After that, I'm going to go with simulation of real world functions, both internally and externally. So for instance, does your game do things like turn signals, headlights, and a lot of sim titles actually do those things. Pit stops, things like, you know, do you have a pit speed limiter? Those things actually are what I think kind of tips the scales for a lot of games and really differentiates between games like Forza and, say, a game like iRacing. iRacing is one of the most simulative titles out there, and even if you take away the multiplayer aspect of it, it's very, very hardcore. I mean, the way the pit stops are done, cautions, it follows all of the functions of racing to a T. It's like being out there on a track engaging in a race with other people, and that's what makes it a more simulative experience. Now, GT Sport has a lot of those things, but they're just not quite at the same level of iRacing. They're just not quite there, and that is by design, by the way. Like I said before, that is by design. Developers don't want to alienate their large base. If you made GT Sport so niche that it had like this huge learning curve like iRacing does, and no one would play it. It wouldn't sell 10 million copies, and the developers know that, so they have to keep that in mind when they keep these features in. Now, having said that, does that mean that someone that plays GT Sport or the Forza games is not a sim racer? Absolutely not. That just means that is the type of sim racing titles that they want to play. The most popular YouTuber sim racer out there, Jimmy Broadbent, if you go look at his channel right now, as of January 1st, 2021, most of his content over the last few months actually is Gran Turismo. And I'm not talking about GT Sport. I'm talking about old school Gran Turismo. That's how he started his channel, is playing Gran Turismo. You know, if you were to go on Reddit or Facebook and even imply that Gran Turismo, and I'm talking the old games, are sim racing titles, people would laugh you off of those pages. But the most popular sim racer out there is playing these games because they're fun and people enjoy watching him play those games. I don't think that he and all of us, we know the limitations of the Gran Turismo titles, so we're not expecting those games to be anything more than they are. Although it's important to note, when the Gran Turismo titles first came out, they were considered simulative because there wasn't a whole lot better on the market, at least from a consumer level standpoint. There were some sims on PC, but as far as what Gran Turismo offered, this car collection title that had these realistic looking at the time, and I suppose realistic handling at the time cars, was considered something special. And it's just that as technology evolved, the Gran Turismo series really didn't. Things like damage model and accessible physics continued with the game, even though other racing titles had surpassed it in those categories. So that's really all I wanted to talk about today. Remember, sim racing is a spectrum. I want you guys to go out there and just play whatever games or whatever sim racing titles or whatever arcade racing titles you feel like playing. If you want to use your $10,000 rig to play Initial D like I'm about to do, then by all means go out and do it. If you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to click like and subscribe so I can continue bringing you more of the sim racing content that you desire to see. And I hope you guys have a great new year and continue to stay safe out there. I'll see you guys later.